December winds howled through the San Juan Mountains like a soul being torn from its body. Inside his crude cabin, Caleb Morrison heard it. Boots crunching snow. Not one set. Four. Their steps were light, but they carried the heavy weight of desperation. He'd been alone for 3 years. 3 long years since the army kicked him out. Branded him a coward for refusing to burn an Apache village to the ground. 3 years of guilt gnawing at him, colder than any winter storm. The knock on his door was soft, almost lost in the wind. Then a voice, clear as ice-cold mountain air, cut through the wood. "I know what you did at Hawks Canyon." Caleb's hand froze on his Winchester rifle. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The past he'd tried to bury in snow and isolation was standing on his porch. He pulled the door open just a crack. A woman stood there, maybe 28, with hair as black as a starless night and eyes that held the kind of secrets men die for. Behind her, 3 other women, all Apache, watched him with the unnerving patience of wolves. She stepped forward into the sliver of light from his lantern. Snow melted on her dark skin like tiny fleeting tears. "My husband was Chief Mongus," she said, her voice steady. "You saved his people." She took another step, so close now he could feel the cold radiating from her clothes. Her dress was torn, clinging to curves that made his mouth go dry. "Now I need saving." She looked him dead in the eye, and the world seemed to stop. "I'll trade myself for shelter one night, for all of us to be safe." What choice did a man with a haunted conscience ever really have? Caleb stepped back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. 4 Apache women on his doorstep meant one thing, and one thing only. Trouble was riding right behind them, and it was riding hard. The leader, the one who called herself Ayana, moved like water, fluid, certain, and powerful. The others were her shadows, an older woman with the scars of a warrior etched into her face, a girl, barely a woman herself, with a swollen belly straining the seams of her dress, and another, younger still, who stared at the ground as if the world itself was too frightening to look at. "No bargain needed," Caleb heard himself say, though his voice cracked like old dry leather. "Get inside." Ayana tilted her head, those dark, knowing eyes studying him, picking him apart. "White men don't give something for nothing." "I'm not most white men," he shot back. A slow, dangerous smile touched her lips. "We will see." The moment they stepped inside, the cabin seemed to shrink. The air grew thick with the smell of wet buckskin, pine smoke, and fear. Ayana's dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing the smooth, perfect line of her collarbone. When she bent to warm her hands by the fire, the rough fabric pulled tight across her hips. Caleb had to force himself to look away, his throat suddenly tight. The pregnant girl, whose name he learned was Senna, collapsed onto his bedroll with a low moan. Dark stains, almost black in the dim light, marked her moccasins. Blood. The older woman, Ka, didn't seek warmth. She moved to the single window, positioning herself like a sentinel, her hand never straying far from a long knife tucked into her belt. The silent one, Nidita, curled into the darkest corner of the cabin, trembling like a leaf in the wind. "How far behind are they?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "Half a day," Ayana answered, her tone holding no fear, only cold calculation. "Maybe less." She watched him, waiting for his reaction, testing him again. "German traders from Durango. They claim we stole horses." "Did you?" Her laugh was a bitter, humorless sound. "We defended ourselves. Apparently that is theft now." Caleb knew the type. Men who saw the frontier not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be pried open, no matter who got hurt. He'd seen blood spilled over accusations like that before. Accusations that usually turned out to be lies. "You can't run in this snow," he said, his gaze falling on Senna. Not with her ready to drop. As if his words were a curse, Senna cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain. She clutched her swollen belly, her knuckles white. Ayana was by her side in an instant, murmuring soft words in Apache, her hands gentle but firm. She looked up and her eyes locked with Caleb's across the small room. The dangerous smile was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying. "The baby is coming," she said. "Tonight." Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters like some hungry beast trying to get in. Inside, a new life was fighting its way into a world that already wanted it dead. Caleb had helped birth foals and calves, his hands slick with the miracle of new life, but never a human child. Never with a posse of killers somewhere out there in the dark, getting closer with every gust of wind. He heated water, found the cleanest cloths he owned, and tried desperately not to think about the men who were coming. He tried not to think about the sound their rifles would make. The hours dragged on, each one an eternity. Senna's breathing became a ragged, desperate thing. The silent girl Nadita held her hand, whispering words he couldn't understand. Ka stood her watch at the window, a statue carved from stone and vengeance. And Ayana. She was the center of the storm. She moved between them all, a dance of command without words, of protection without weapons. During a brief moment of quiet, as Senna gathered her strength, Ayana spoke to him. Tell me about Hawks Canyon. Caleb's jaw tightened into a knot. Nothing to tell. There is. She stepped closer, so close he could smell the wild sage woven into her hair, so close her breath ghosted across his cheek. My husband spoke of a soldier who disobeyed a direct order, a white man who warned our scouts about the raid that was planned for that night. The memory slammed into him like a physical blow. Colonel Hayes, his face purple with rage, screaming, "Burn it all! Leave nothing but ash!" And Caleb, seeing the faces of children in the firelight, knowing he couldn't be the one to turn them into ghosts. "Got me a court-martial," he said, his voice rough. "It got my people time to run." Her hand, impossibly soft, touched his arm. It was a brand of heat that seared through his worn shirt. "Some of them lived. Because of you." Before he could find a single word to say in response, Senna screamed. It wasn't a cry of pain anymore. It was a sound that tore through the fabric of the night, a sound of flesh and soul being ripped apart. Ayana was on her knees in an instant, speaking low and steady. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes pleading, demanding. "I need you." So he knelt beside her, the broken soldier and the Apache chief's widow, working together to bring a new life into the world while death hunted them in the blizzard outside. When the baby finally crowned, a slick and perfect little head, Caleb caught the small body in his own scarred hands. A new person, drawing her first breath in his cabin. A daughter. Senna sobbed with exhaustion and relief as Ayana cleaned the child, wrapping her in Caleb's cleanest shirt. The baby's first cry wasn't loud, but it pierced the tense silence like a ray of hope. "She will need a name," Ayana said softly. Senna, her eyes barely open, looked at Caleb. A flicker of gratitude, of connection, passed between them. "Paloma," she whispered, "for the dove that must have led us here. To you." Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains. The world outside was a canvas of white and shadow. Through the window, Caleb saw them, riders on the ridge, 5, maybe 6 of them, picking their way carefully down the treacherous slope. Their voices carried on the wind, harsh and guttural. German. Ka's hand tightened around the hilt of her knife, her knuckles white. Nidita shrank deeper into the corner, making herself small. Even little Paloma seemed to sense the approaching danger, her soft cries fading into whimpers. Ayana came to stand beside Caleb at the window, her shoulder brushing against his. The contact sent a jolt through him. "They will want to search the cabin," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Then we make sure they don't find what they're looking for," Caleb replied, his mind racing. Her dark eyes, flecked with gold in the morning light, found his. "What are you thinking?" "Something," he said, turning to face her fully, "that will probably get us both killed." He saw a flicker of something in her expression. Not fear, understanding. "You said you would trade yourself for shelter," he reminded her. A slow, deliberate nod. "I did." "Then let's give them a story they'll believe." The riders were close now, so close he could hear the jingle of their harnesses, the curses they muttered as their horses slipped in the deep snow. The knock, when it came, wasn't a request. It was a demand, shaking the entire cabin. Thunder in the morning. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, glancing at his own reflection in the frosted windowpane. A stranger looked back at him, a man with haunted eyes and a grim line for a mouth. Behind him, the cabin had transformed. 3 Apache women had simply vanished. Kai was wedged into the darkness of the root cellar. Senna and baby Paloma were hidden under the rough-hewn bed, concealed by blankets. Nidita was tucked away behind a tall stack of firewood. Only Ayana remained, and the sight of her stole the breath from his lungs. She had torn her dress further, letting it slip provocatively off one shoulder. Her black hair, once braided, now fell loose and wild around her face. When she moved to stand beside him at the door, she pressed her hip against his thigh with a deliberate, shocking intimacy. "Remember," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "I'm yours now." The door creaked open to reveal a man named Klaus Muller. He was flanked by 4 other men, each with a face as hard and unforgiving as the mountains around them. Klaus had the soft hands of a man who'd never done a day of honest work, but his eyes were cold and cruel. He was a man who paid others to commit his violence for him. "Morrison," Klaus said, his eyes flicking past Caleb to fix on Ayana, like a predator locking onto its prey. "We are tracking horse thieves. The trail leads directly here." Caleb kept his voice impossibly steady. "No thieves here. Just me and my woman." Klaus took a step inside, his gaze crawling over Ayana like a foul insect. He studied her as if she were a piece of livestock at an auction. "This Apache squaw? She is yours?" The slur hit Caleb like a physical slap, but Ayana's hand, suddenly on his arm, kept him rooted in place. She moved forward, deliberately letting her dress slide lower, revealing the soft curve of her breast. "I belong to him," she said, her voice a husky, calculated invitation. "He treats me very well." One of Klaus's men licked his chapped lips, his eyes hungry. "Mighty fine piece you got there, Morrison." A hot red wave of fury flooded Caleb's vision. Before he could act on it, Ayana pressed herself against his side, her hand finding the cold steel of the gun on his hip. "He doesn't share what is his," she purred, looking up at Caleb with an expression of pure possession. "Do you, my love?" The endearment, so false and yet so potent, sent a current of electricity through his veins. Her fingers traced the outline of his colt, a gesture that was both a caress and a clear warning. Klaus's eyes narrowed, the amusement fading. "We searched the cabin. Make sure your woman did not bring stolen property with her." "Search all you want," Caleb growled, his arm wrapping around Ayana's waist, pulling her tight against him. "But you touch what's mine, and you and I will have words." The men moved through his small home like a plague of locusts. They kicked over his furniture, pawed through his meager supplies. One of them yanked open the root cellar door, but Ka had burrowed deep amongst the potato sacks, becoming one with the shadows. Another stooped to look under the bed where Senna lay, holding her breath, her body shielding her newborn child. Little Paloma, dosed with a drop of opium tea, remained as silent as a stone. Through it all, Ayana played her part to perfection. She fetched Klaus a cup of water, bending low so he could see down the front of her dress. She stoked the fire, the movement pulling the fabric tight across her backside. When one of the men got too close, she shrank against Caleb, a perfect imitation of a frightened woman seeking the protection of her man. "You have no others here?" Klaus asked, his eyes still searching, still suspicious. "Just her," Caleb said, his grip on Ayana tightening. "Found her wandering lost near Silverton. Needed a woman for the winter." Klaus studied them for a long, uncomfortable moment. Something flickered in his pale eyes. Was it suspicion, or just the bitter disappointment of not finding what he came for? "These thieves," he said slowly, "the ones we track, they had children with them. We heard a baby crying in the night, from this direction." Caleb felt Ayana go rigid against him. Under the bed, a new mother and her child lay as still as death. "Ain't heard no baby," Caleb said, forcing a shrug. "Sound carries funny in these mountains. Could have been a mountain cat." "Yes, perhaps." Klaus backed toward the door, his men following. "If you see any more Apache women, you tell the authorities in Durango. There is a reward." "I'll keep that in mind," Caleb said, his voice flat. After they rode away, Caleb waited a full hour, the silence in the cabin stretching thin. Ayana remained pressed against him, both of them listening for the sound of returning hoofbeats. When nothing but the wind remained, she finally stepped away. The sudden loss of her warmth felt like another winter descending. Ka emerged from the cellar, covered in dirt but unharmed. Nidita uncurled herself from the woodpile. Senna crawled out from under the bed, clutching baby Paloma, who blinked in the returning light. They were all alive. They were safe. For now. That was well done, Ka said. It was the first time the old warrior had spoken to him directly. Ayana smoothed her dress, a gesture that seemed almost shy after the bold performance she had just given. They will be back, she said, her voice low and certain. Men like Klaus Muller do not give up so easily. Caleb nodded, his eyes on the tracks their horses had left in the snow. We need a better plan, something more permanent. Ayana looked at him, her expression unreadable. You could turn us in, she said quietly. Collect the reward. Start over somewhere else, free and clear. The suggestion landed like a punch to the gut. Is that what you think of me? She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for the truth. I do not know what to think. You saved us today, but tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll do it again, he said, the words coming out harder and faster than he'd intended. And the day after that. Something shifted in her face. The mask she'd worn for Klaus, the mask of the warrior she'd worn since she arrived, it all fell away. For a brief second, he saw the uncertainty, the exhaustion, the fear she held so tightly inside. Why? She whispered. Because watching her play the part of the seductress had awakened something in him he thought long dead. Because the way she had said "my love" had felt more real than any truth he'd known in years. Because holding her against him, protecting her, had felt like the first right thing he'd done since he'd walked away from Hawks Canyon. Because it's the right thing to do, he said instead. Outside, the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, bearing the tracks of their enemies. Inside, 4 Apache women were settling into his life, into his home, as if they belonged there. And maybe, Caleb thought, watching Ayana take baby Paloma from Senna's tired arms, her touch impossibly gentle, maybe they did. The question was, could he keep them safe long enough to find out for sure? The days that followed were a strange dream. The lie they had told Klaus Muller began to feel less like a lie and more like a fragile, unspoken truth. Ayana moved through the small cabin with a natural grace, as if she had lived there her whole life. She cooked meals that filled the space with smells he hadn't realized he missed. She mended his worn clothes with small, careful stitches. At night, she slept beside him on his narrow cot. They never touched, but her warmth next to him in the deep mountain cold was a comfort he hadn't known he was starving for. It was a dangerous comfort, one that could get them all killed. The others found their rhythms too. Ka, the old warrior, would sit by the fire carving small wooden figures, occasionally teaching Caleb a word in her native tongue. Nidita, the silent girl, was no longer silent. She hummed soft lullabies to baby Paloma, her voice low and sweet. Senna grew stronger with each passing day, and sometimes Caleb would even hear the sound of her laughter, a sound as precious as gold. It felt like a family, a strange, broken, hunted family. It felt like something worth fighting for, which was good, because a fight was coming. Caleb saw it first, a faint cloud of dust against the clear blue sky to the east. It was too organized for a herd of animals, too fast for a trader's wagon. He grabbed his spyglass, his heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat in his chest. 5 riders moving with purpose, and the winter sun glinted off something on their chests. Badges. Marshals, he said, lowering the glass. Ayana was beside him in an instant, baby Paloma cradled in her arms. How many? 5, and they're led by Henderson. The name landed in the quiet cabin like a lit stick of dynamite. Marshal Wade Henderson wasn't just lawman, he was a legend, a man known for his cold, methodical pursuit of justice. And he had a particular, unrelenting hatred for the Apache. Inside the cabin, a controlled chaos erupted. Senna and Nidita moved toward the back door, a desperate escape plan in their eyes. But Ka blocked their path, her hand already on the rifle Caleb had given her. Too late, she grunted, peering through a crack in the wall. They have the canyon mouth covered. Caleb saw it too. 2 of the marshals were breaking off from the main group, circling around to cover the rear of the cabin. They were professionals. Thorough. They know, Ayana said, her voice barely a whisper. They know we are all here. Klaus Muller had gone straight to the law, and this time there would be no clever tricks, no seductive lies. Henderson hadn't come to search. He had come for bodies. The knock on the door was like a gunshot. "Caleb Morrison, this is United States Marshal Henderson. Open the door." Caleb cracked the door open, his Winchester held ready but low. Henderson stood on the porch, a tall man with eyes as gray and cold as a winter sky. Three other marshals stood behind him, their hands on their guns, their faces grim. "Marshal," Caleb nodded. "Step aside, Morrison," Henderson said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We're here for the Apache women." "What women?" A smile touched Henderson's lips, but it held no warmth. It was the smile of a predator. "The four fugitives you're harboring, identified by Klaus Muller, wanted for horse theft and for the murder of two of his men." The new charge, murder, hung in the air. Behind Caleb, he heard the soft, deadly click of Ka's rifle being cocked. In the corner, Nadita clutched Paloma so tightly the baby let out a small whimper. "I don't know what you're talking about," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "Step aside." Henderson's hand moved, hovering over the butt of his pistol. His men shifted their weight, fanning out, ready. The world slowed down. Time stretched like taffy. Caleb saw it all in a single terrifying instant. The positions of the marshals, the angles of fire, the impossible distance to any real cover. Five of them. Five of him and the women. But one of his was still weak from childbirth. Another was a traumatized girl. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. "No," Caleb said. Henderson drew his gun with blinding speed. But Caleb was faster. The Winchester roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The marshal spun backward, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder. And then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from every direction at once. The air filled with the smell of sulfur and splintered wood. Caleb dove to the left as a volley of bullets shredded the doorframe where he'd been standing. Behind him, Ka's rifle cracked once, then twice. One of the marshals outside screamed and went down. "Nadita, get down!" Ayana shouted, but the young girl was already moving, scrambling toward the relative safety of the root cellar, with Paloma in her arms. A bullet shattered the window just above her head, raining down a shower of deadly glass. Senna, who just days before could barely stand, grabbed Caleb's old army pistol from the mantel. "I will not go back to the reservation," she whispered, her voice fierce with a mother's protective rage. "I will not!" Caleb rolled behind the heavy oak table, returning fire. Two marshals were down, but Henderson was still moving, blood streaming from his shoulder, trying to get a clear line of fire around the side of the cabin. Ka rose from behind the stove, her rifle aimed true, but a shot cracked from the trees outside. She jerked as if struck by lightning, a crimson flower blooming on her chest. She fell hard, the rifle clattering to the floor. "Ka!" Nadita screamed from the cellar opening. It was the first word anyone had heard her speak above a whisper in months. The sound, raw and filled with anguish, seemed to break something in the air. It was a battle cry of pure grief. Ayana was at Ka's side instantly, pressing a cloth to the wound, whispering, "Stay with us. Stay with us." Henderson appeared in the open doorway, his gun raised, his face a mask of cold fury. "Enough!" he bellowed. Caleb swung his Winchester around, but Henderson was already squeezing the trigger, his pistol aimed directly at Ayana's back. Senna moved. In a blur of motion, she stepped directly into the line of fire. The bullet took her high in the chest. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with a look of pure surprise. She crumpled to the floor, right beside the makeshift cradle, where her daughter had been born into a world of violence. "No!" Ayana's scream tore through the sudden, ringing silence. Henderson's gun swung toward her. Caleb had one shot, one chance. He didn't aim. He just fired. The Winchester roared one last time. Henderson dropped like a sack of grain. Silence fell like a heavy shroud. The smell of gun smoke was thick, choking. Outside, the wounded marshals moaned. Inside, the cost of their victory was horribly clear. Senna lay still, a pool of dark blood spreading beneath her. Ka was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Nadita knelt by the cellar door, rocking back and forth, holding Paloma and weeping. words pouring out of her now in a torrent of Apache grief. "She's gone," Ayana whispered, her hands covered in Senna's blood. "She's gone." Caleb looked at his home, the shattered windows, the bullet-scarred walls. He looked at the women who had trusted him to keep them safe, and he knew he had failed them. The law would send more men, an army of them. They would all hang now, unless... "Pack what you can carry," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "We leave in 10 minutes. "Where?" Ka gasped from the floor, her face pale. Caleb helped Ayana lift her, wrapping the wound as tightly as he could. "Mexico. I know a place. People who can help us." Nadita stood up, clutching Paloma, her voice surprisingly strong through her tears. "What about Senna?" There was no time to bury her. Not properly, but they couldn't just leave her. Not for Henderson's men to find, to desecrate. Ayana walked to Senna's body and gently touched her face. Then with a look of grim resolve, she grabbed a pry bar and began pulling up the floorboards. "She stays with her home," Ayana said, her voice like steel. "She chose this." Her eyes met Caleb's. "We burn it all." And so they did. They loaded what little food and supplies they had onto Caleb's 2 horses. They wrapped the wounded Ka in every blanket they owned. And as they rode away, orange flames began to lick at the log walls of the only home Caleb had known for 3 years. Behind them, a column of black smoke rose into the cold winter sky, a funeral pyre and a prayer all in one. Ahead of them lay nothing but the unknown. Exile, hardship, a future written in blood. But they rode together, and as Ayana's hand found his in the darkness of the trail, Caleb knew that was something no law, no marshal, and no army could ever take away from them. They rode for weeks, a desperate journey south. The trail was a blur of snow-choked passes, frozen rivers, and the constant, gnawing fear of being followed. Ka's wound festered, and her fever burned hot. Caleb used every bit of his old army training, every scrap of knowledge about the wilderness, to keep them hidden, to keep them moving. He set false trails, doubled back on their tracks, and chose paths no sane person would dare to travel. One night, huddled around a smokeless fire in a hidden cave, Ayana finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Who was Henderson, really? He looked at you, like he knew you." Caleb stared into the embers, the ghosts of the past swirling in the heat. "He was a lieutenant at Hawks Canyon. He was right beside Colonel Hayes, giving the orders." Ayana went still. "The orders you refused." "He called me a traitor then," Caleb said, his voice flat. "I guess he never changed his mind." The pursuit hadn't just been about the law. It had been personal, a 15-year-old grudge. They finally crossed into Mexico, the air growing warmer, the landscape changing from snow-covered pines to dusty red rock and cactus. They were weak, starving, and haunted, but they were alive. Caleb led them to a small, hidden Apache village, a community of exiles and survivors tucked away in the Sierra Madre Mountains. They were taken in, cared for. Ka, against all odds, began to heal under the care of the village shaman. Nadita, surrounded by people who spoke her language and understood her grief, started to find her voice again, teaching the village children the old songs. And Paloma, little Paloma, thrived. She was the heart of their small, broken family, her smiles and gurgles a constant reminder of what they had fought for. The lie from the cabin, the one born of desperation, slowly, carefully, began to transform into truth. Caleb and Ayana were rarely apart. They worked together, ate together, cared for Paloma together. One evening, as they watched the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Ayana turned to him. "You never asked," she said softly. "Asked what?" "Why we really ran. It wasn't just about horses, or the men we killed." She took a deep breath. "Klaus Muller wasn't just a traitor. He was a smuggler. He had a chest, full of Union Army gold, stolen during the war. My husband, Chief Mongus, discovered his route. He planned to take the gold." Caleb stared at her. "Why?" "To buy back our land," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The land the government stole from us. He had made a deal with a corrupt agent. The gold was the price for our freedom, for a home where our children could grow up safe. Klaus found out. He attacked our camp. He killed my husband. The story poured out of her. They hadn't stolen anything. They had fought back. They had been trying to reclaim what was theirs, a future for their people. They had managed to grab only one small saddlebag in the chaos, not the whole chest. A saddlebag filled not with gold, but with something else. What was in the bag? Caleb asked. Ayana reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out a worn leather-bound book. A ledger. Muller's records, she said. Names, dates, payments, proof of his smuggling ring, and proof of the army officers he was paying off. Caleb's blood ran cold. Henderson's name is in there? She nodded. And another one. Colonel Hayes. The whole ugly picture snapped into focus. Henderson hadn't just been hunting them for a grudge. He had been cleaning up a loose end, silencing the only people who could expose him and his old commanding officer. Justice. The word echoed in Caleb's mind. It wasn't enough to just survive. It wasn't enough to hide. Men like Hayes and Muller had to be stopped. With the help of the village elders, a plan was formed. A message was sent north, not to the law but to the press. An ambitious young reporter in Santa Fe who had a reputation for taking on the powerful. The ledger, along with Ayana's sworn testimony, was a bomb waiting to explode. Months later, news trickled down to their secluded village. The story had broken. Colonel Hayes and several other high-ranking officers were disgraced, their careers ruined. Klaus Muller, abandoned by his powerful partners, was found dead in a Durango alley, likely at the hands of his own men. Justice had been served, not by a gun, but by the truth. One clear, cool evening, Caleb stood with Ayana on a ridge overlooking their new home. Paloma, now a toddler, chased a butterfly between them, her laughter echoing in the quiet air. She had Ayana's eyes and a spirit that was all her own. "We are safe now," Ayana said, her hand finding his. "We are," he agreed. The long years of guilt, of running, of fighting, were over. He looked at this incredible woman beside him, at the child who called him Papa, at the peaceful village below. He hadn't just found a place to hide. He had found a place to belong, a reason to hope. He had been a soldier who refused to destroy a village, and in the end, a village had saved him. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "That night you knocked on my door?" She turned to him, her face soft in the fading light. She raised a hand to his cheek, her touch gentle. "My husband's spirit led us to you that night," she whispered. "He knew you were a man of honor. He knew you would protect his family." She smiled, a true radiant smile that reached her eyes. He was right. In her arms, with their daughter's laughter as the only music, Caleb Morrison finally understood. He hadn't saved them. They had saved him. They had given the lonely man in the mountains a love worth every single risk they had ever taken. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Sometimes the greatest tales of justice and redemption are the ones history tried to bury in the snow.